So here we go, airbox removal tutorial at last. Finally, we've been after this for a long time now. Obviously, it's probably our most frequently asked question, how do you do it? So we're going to remove the airbox today. This is much more the how-to of removing the airbox. We're going to do a separate video as well, which is the why, which is going to be a frequently asked questions that we often get. So we're going to do a step-by-step process on how to get this lump out of the middle. We're going to break down the tools that you're going to need, the torque settings you're going to need, and we're also going to do both processes. So we're going to do the nut and bolt factory PCC sort of slash BMW version where we take the entire bike apart. What you might want to do, and what we probably see 80 or 90% of our customers who buy the airbox removal kit doing, is cutting the airbox out. We don't like that process as a process if we can avoid it, because obviously as a company we're not going to say go out there and take a hacksaw to your bike, because you could jib up your frame or anything else, and we basically don't want to take the responsibility or liability of that. However, it is possible. So we're not saying you can't do it, we're just saying that's not the way we're telling you to do it. So we will do both processes in this video. We'll get to a point where we'll show where to cut if you decide to do the cut. Otherwise, we'll then go the whole way, take the whole frame, break this down into basically a unicycle and put it back together. So I'm going to hand over to Stu shortly and we'll get cracking.
Okay, so let's get into this airbox removal. So as you would have already seen our back catalogue of YouTube videos, you'd have got your bike to the stage that we're at now. Tank off, battery out, seat off. This is the stage we need to get to before we can really crack on with the bare bones of this build. In this section here, I'm going to show you the stage that you can get to basically, if you want to, cut the airbox out. So that will involve removing the scoop, the air temperature sensor, and the intake tubes. You'll need some special tools to do that. You'll have the snips and some BMW clips. You can use a flat blade screwdriver to work around that. Just be very careful with the clips. They can bend up and be a little bit delicate, but please try your very best to be careful with them so you can reuse them at the end. And a bog old standard flat blade screwdriver will do the rest for you. Let's get into it. Okay, so we're at the stage we need to be at if you want to cut the airbox out. We recommend doing it the full factory way. We don't want to be held responsible for some lemon with a hacksaw slipping, cutting the box in half and jibbing their frame at the same time. It's going to be an absolute world of pain if you want to get the frame repowder coated, because then you're going to have to remove it all anyway, and you should have done it the factory way to start off with. However, the box is completely hollow as long as the temperature sensor and the front throttle distribution box is removed. You should have no trouble with cracking on and cutting that out. I recommend leaving it bolted in, because I can imagine that's going to be an absolute pain in the arse if it's wobbling about whilst you're trying to cut it. Anyway, we're at the stage you need to be at to do it the full factory way, and that is to remove the exhaust before you put the stand on, because where the exhaust comes along and kicks up towards the back of the bike, it's going to get in the way of removing the rear frame where it has a little crossbar that goes underneath. So once you've got the exhaust removed, that frame on there, the front end tied down and secure, and obviously before you would have started, your workshop frame would have been put in place anyway to make sure that the bike isn't going to fall over. Now that you've got that all in place, put a little bit of pressure on the middle of the engine to make sure that the rear of the bike is in the air ever so slightly with a little bit of a weight bias towards the front. That's going to make it a lot easier to remove all of the stuff on the rear. We're going to do that now. We're going to do the removal of the tyre, the shock, the torsion bar, and the rear final drive and swinging arm. And we're going to crack on with that. Okay, so we're at the stage now where the wheel's off and the shock is out. Next stage now is to remove the swinging arm and the final drive. So the stage I needed to get to for this, the tools I needed for that stage is a T50 half-inch socket with a half-inch ratchet. That's the same tool for the 5 bolts that hold in the wheel and the 2 bolts that hold in the shock. You're just going to have to adjust the balance of the bike to allow for the shock to come out, because there's going to be a bit of tension on the bottom bolt, because you're essentially taking out what is holding the bike up when you remove the rear shock. Apart from that, we can put all this to one side and crack on with the next bit, which is swinging arm and final drive and torsion bar out. Okay, so we're at the stage where the final drive and the swinging arm are going to come out. You're going to have to remove the caliper, and I say remove the torsion bar. You're going to undo it and remove it so it's out of your way. A little tip here for this section is I would highly recommend removing the rear sets or the foot peg mount on this side. It's going to give you a lot more room to work, and it's just going to get in the way otherwise, because we're going to have to undo this pivot cap anyway. So when removing the torsion bar, you're going to have a T50 Torx on the front here. Recommend that you use a 1/2-inch Torx drive for that, and you've got a 16mm bolt, non-captive nut on the back. I would recommend that you undo the nut as opposed to undoing the bolt. It is Loctited in. If you try to undo the bolt, you're going to be putting a lot of stress through that join there, and also you run the risk of slipping and scratching your final drive. Plus, if you've got a nut and bolt situation, you should always undo the nut first. So we're going to crack on with that now, and the tools to do that for the final drive and the caliper that's bolted to it is the T45 Torx, and you can either go with 1/2-inch or 3/8 for that. Once that's out of the way, we can crack on with the rest. Okay, so when doing this bit, something to note is you've got a loop here on the rear frame for luggage. Just take a cable tie and loop it through the caliper pin. Just keeps it out of the way, stopping it swinging down and hitting your swinging arm or final drive whilst you're taking it off. Keeps things secure. Where Rory's working at the moment is where the ABS sensor is plugged into the bike. We recommend taking the ABS sensor out from what we call the bike side of the loom and not down on the final drive, because the ABS sensor is immersed in oil. So if you take that out, you're going to end up spilling oil all over the place. What Rory's doing there is just unplugging it under the seat. That then loops down from the inside of the frame to the outside and along the top of the torsion bar and down to the final drive. With that out of the way, you can then remove it all. Way more than 2. Jesus. We're going to take the bolt out of the torsion bar here. As you can see, I've got an axle stand. Most people have an axle stand kicking around in their garage if they're doing a lot of maintenance, motorbike stuff, or even car stuff themselves. Have this ready, because you're going to need to have this rear workshop stand out of the way, because when you drop down the bolt to take it out, it's going to want to flop about and get in the way. So get this down ready. Axle stand there. Workshop stand out of the way. And make sure the final drive is supported, because you need to remove a little bit of weight to remove the pivot bolt out of the way. You see there's a decent amount of Loctite on that bolt. As you can see from the shot I done earlier, it's a real pain to get out. Make sure you undo the nut and not the bolt beforehand, because you're going to get that picking up and it's going to be a problem. With the axle stand in place, you're now at the stage where the final drive is unsupported other than the bottom pivot bolt here, so it will want to rock back and forth. You also have the drive shaft in here. The drive shaft will then want to slide on the male end of the final drive. Have some stuff ready so it doesn't want to flop down. You can do this bit on your own. However, like I said, whether you've got a block or an axle stand here, something to support the final drive so it's not going to fall down and crash on the floor and bend your disc, and then we're all going to be upset. Okay, so a little bit more detail on from where we got to with the last section. So now that we've got the axle stand in place, supporting the rear swinging arm and final drive of the bike, what you want to do is remove the axle stand and then allow the swinging arm to drop down and just sit on the rear bar that goes across the bottom of the frame, and allow the final drive to drop down. You'll feel there'll be a little bit of resistance where the final drive male section is still sitting in the female section of the drive shaft. Quick knock and you'll see it want to release down. You can see that the drive shaft is sitting there with a load of this white stuff, which is BMW MP3 paste. Make sure you've got a cloth ready because your hands are going to get absolutely covered in it. Okay, so now that we're at this stage here, we're at a really good section to be like, okay, so the real bones of the job has been done. It's now a case of no longer worrying about being supportive with weight for the final drive, swing arm, etc, etc. Calipers out the way, torsion bars out the way. We can really now crack on and get the cable tie on the front gaiter snipped and show you how to remove the drive shaft, and then the final stage will be swinging arm out. And then we're pretty much on the home run then to get the rear frame out the way and get to the final bit, which is box out. So in this little bit here, we're going to go into detail about how we're going to get the swing arm out of the bike. We've got the final drive sitting on the workbench here. The drive shaft is loose off of the final drive. We're going to be working in and around the frame here. So please be very careful when you're working around the frame and the powder coated parts around it, which is the frame and the gearbox itself. We're going to need to cut the cable tie off of this gaiter between the gearbox and the swinging arm. Like I said before, working around painted areas, please be very, very careful when you're cutting things to make sure nothing's damaged. Once we've done that, I'm then going to show you with a couple close-ups how to remove the joint or split the joint between the gearbox and the swinging arm using cloth and a lever bar, just to put some pressure on the front half of the drive shaft, just to push it back towards the rear of the bike. When doing so, you'll need to support the back of the drive shaft with your hand to make sure the knuckle of the drive shaft doesn't hit on the back of the swinging arm, and then you feel a little bit of resistance. But like I said, we'll do some close-ups of that so you can see that in a little bit more detail. Right, so you're working in quite a restricted space, but you see you've got the gaiter that sits on this unpainted section of the gearbox. If you pull that back there, you can just about see that that's where the shaft mates to the gearbox. Like I said, have a cloth at the ready, and you want to make sure you've got a cloth in between the lever bar and the frame. Don't worry about between the lever bar and the gearbox. And then you'll feel some resistance on the front of the lever bar. Give that a slight wiggle, and then you'll work the drive shaft off, and you'll get some movement at the back there. Okay, so we are at the stage where it's going to be luck of the gods, basically, because this will either come straight out or it will be seized in. We have a special tool for doing this. It's actually a BMW special tool. You can make something like this at home. You've got M6 thread, which you need to go into this center bolt here. Once I've got this all removed, you'll see in a moment how I go ahead and do that. This is basically a slider slash bearing pivot that goes in there. That is for the rear swinging arm bearings that sits in there. On the other side, there is a pre-tensioned Allen key bolt and lock nut. That's going to be a little bit more difficult to remove, but I can show you that in more detail in a moment. We've had these seized before. We've had these come straight out, very much like the removal of the rear shock with that slider bush that goes in there. It's luck of the draw. It'll either come straight out or it won't. This is a T30 Torx to get this out. Give it a go. If you get lucky, you get lucky. If you don't, a little bit of threaded bar with something on the end, tie it to a horse and shoot it out the garage, whatever, you can get it done. It's just a case of cracking on with it. All right, so these 3 bolts here, they just hold this, what is essentially a top hat, in place. By undoing these, the swinging arm isn't all of a sudden going to fall out. You can undo these and leave them in place. You can then put your slider bar in there and then pull it out. You don't want to do that until you've removed the other side and you've got also somebody here ready to support the swinging arm for when you pull it all out. It's something that you can do on your own. Put things in place to make sure nothing gets damaged or scratched. But like I said, if you've got someone else with you here, it will make this little section that much easier. So this is essentially what is the part 2 of removing the rear swinging arm. We've already done the other side first with the top cap and the bolts that hold that in place. Don't remove that until you've done this section here. You've got a plastic cover on the left-hand side of the frame, which covers up the Allen key, which pre-tensions, it's an Allen key bolt that pre-tensions the swinging arm and the lock nut that holds that in place. Just find yourself a very small flat blade screwdriver. If you can have a fairly sharp end on it that hasn't been damaged, you'll find that there's a tab on this cover that allows you just to put the flat blade in there and pop it off. You'll then see the size of Allen key and lock nut or socket to remove the lock nut that you need to do that. Whilst you're here, you also need to remove the ball joint that holds the gearbox selector or the gearbox foot selector in place. Remove that now because you don't want to remove that when you've got the frame all undone and loose because it's going to get in your way and it's going to be a problem when you're removing it. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. With this removed, when the Allen key bolt has been removed, you can then remove the opposite side. Don't remove them both individually. You kind of want to remove them in tandem because it's holding the swing arm in place. Then you want to have somebody ready to remove the swing arm with you. And we are pretty much at that stage ready to tackle the rear frame bolts that hold them in place and get them off. Okay, so with the cover removed, it's revealed the Allen key bolt that pre-tensions the swinging arm and the lock nut that holds it in place. That's a 12mm Allen key and the lock nut is a 30mm socket. Both fairly standard sizes, however, you might find that you need to go out and buy yourself a 12mm because that won't be in your standard set. Your standard set might go up to 10, and your 30mm socket, you might find that your standard set necessarily only goes up to 28 or even 22. Get those done, then you can get the stuff undone. You're going to need to remove the lock nut first, remove that, and then we can then back this Allen key bolt off ever so slightly to then go back to the other side, remove that top nut slide or that top hat slider. Then at that point, with them both removed, you can get somebody to give you a hand and the rear swinging arm is ready to be removed. All right, so with the 30mm socket on the lock nut, get yourself prepared, get a long bar, a decent strength, a 1/2 inch ratchet. It's a very tight nut. The torque setting for this is 145 Newton meters. So prepare yourself for a little bit of a battle getting this off and make sure that your elbow is out the way of anything if your arm was to slip, to make sure you don't hit the bike, hit the frame or hurt yourself. No, this is just going to be one of those things where dun 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 dun. Okay, so we're pretty much at the final leg now of this. We've got the final drive and the swinging arm out of the bike. As you can see, you've got what is the cavity that this was in behind me. Now you want to take 5 minutes. I know you're going to be dead excited to be like, okay, let's get this done, let's crack on. However, you do need to take 5 minutes just to walk around the rear frame area and have a look at the things like the brake line. Like for example, earlier we cable tied this up out the way. This needs to be removed and dropped down to this area here now that the swing arm's out the way, because this is going to have to go up into that area and when the rear frame is removed. You need to go around and make sure that lines are disconnected, there's some cable ties that you've missed, some lines that have been rerouted incorrectly. Just go around, take 5 minutes, like I said, and just have a good look at the bike and where the frame interacts with the wiring loom. Make sure you're not going to get caught out when you're at that final little bit where you're really excited to pull it off and you're getting caught out by a cable tie. We've done it plenty of times. So just take those 5 minutes to have a good look and you're going to get it off in no problems. So you'll get caught out on this, we got caught out on this unless you do this bit, and that is to remove the side stand switch. It's 2 cable ties that hold it to the rear frame. Get them removed, get them cutting out of the way, and you won't have any trouble of it snagging up when you remove the rear frame. Okay, so we are literally at the last stage before the frame is coming off. You've now got 4 bolts that need to be removed that are the main frame bolts, but you've got 2 other things that will catch you out. You've got what is essentially the 5th bolt of the frame that lots of people won't see because it's bolted to the bottom of the frame and gearbox underneath. You've got the T50 at the top, T55 at the bottom, and the T45 that will catch you out at the bottom of the gearbox there. Get that one out. There's also the bolt that you need to focus on when you're putting the frame back together. That's going to help you align a lot of stuff up. Now, the other thing to remember is on the other side of the airbox is the breather hose that comes off of the left-hand cylinder head. Get that unclipped and get that removed because you'll go to all the trouble of getting the rear frame off, get the box off at the same time, and something will be snagging, and it guarantee you it will be that hose. You've also got 4, 2 at the top at the front and 2 underneath, T30s that hold the airbox to the frame. Get those undone. So you want to undo in recap, you want to undo the airbox first, undo the T45 at the bottom, then loosen off these 2 here, get somebody to hold the rear of the frame, T50s out at the top, and then the last one will be the T55s out the bottom, and then off it goes. So that's what we're going to do next. Yeah. Okie doke, so we've at the halfway point of the ABR strip. As you can see, we now have a unicycle that was an R9T, the airbox. That's it, folks. That's it, that's gone. That did occupy this space up in here. So we've got a few things to bear in mind now when you refit it. Obviously, to avoid damage to the gearbox, the engine, the frame, you want to do it with someone else giving you a hand to get it in. It can be tight in this area here around the gearbox. There is a lot more space down on the left hand side where the starter motor is opposed on the right hand side where the frame interacts with the gearbox. Make sure that this is routed correctly when it goes in, and bearing in mind you've then got elements of the wiring loom that needs to be put on the right side of the frame when it goes back together. Essentially, you are now at the point, once the airbox gone, this part of the build or this part of the process is very, very quickly. It's a case of frame off, airbox out, near enough, frame back on. The one thing that I do want to emphasize is you have your top bolt, which is your T50 bolt, which goes just sneaks into that spot up there, and your lower T55 bolt down here. Please lock tight both of these. The bottom bolt, which goes in to the gearbox, which is your T45, that's the one that often gets forgotten about. Please don't forget about it. No Loctite on that. None of it needs to be done. Torque settings are all labelled in the show notes below. It shows top and bottom and the rear one there. Please make sure they are torqued up correctly, and make sure that before they are torqued up, everything's done up by hand, and that you've made sure that all the wires, cables, hoses are all in the right place. So Without further ado, Rory and I are going to slide that all back on and we can show you that. Okay, so we're now at the stage where we're going to be putting the swinging arm back in. As you can see, Roy and I just fitted the rear frame. It's not too hard. Obviously, we've done it quite a few times, so you'd like to think we're quite good at it by now. But if you're methodical with it and you don't try and force it, and make sure that you keep an eye on, especially the bottom, not so much, but regards its relationship with the gearbox, but the top where it interacts with the engine, the loom, the clutch pipe, all different brake pipes. There's areas where you need to just keep your wits about you when you put the frame on. It does go on quite easy. Then make sure you put things in by hand and then methodically go around, make sure everything's in place, and then start tightening things up. The torque settings are on the fitting instructions that are on the product page, as well as we've done a very handy blog with all of the BMW torque settings on it, which is on our website. Please reference both of those for the final stages of this process for all of the torque settings. Obviously there are quite a few here. We can't go through absolutely all of them, hence why we got the instructions on the product page as well as the blog. However, methodical work is going to be your friend in this process. Like I said, go around and then torque it all up, make sure it's thoroughly in place, and then we can now move on to the swinging arm refitment. So there's a couple bits that you also need to be aware of on this here. I've got some BMW MP3 paste. This is the BMW grease that they use for greasing up the top hat slider here for the bearing, as well as a little bit on the Allen key bolt that holds on the pre-tension for the swing arm bearings. You can see that there's a little bit of MP3 paste here on the gator, as well as a little bit that should be on the end of this drive shaft here. Put a little bit on here just to help it go on to the male end of the gearbox, and if you've got one that's got plenty on down this end, don't worry yourself about putting it on. Something that you need to do before, it's easier to do now before you get it all together and then you spend ages struggling to do it like I did. This is all stuff that we've learned beforehand. This is all stuff that we've struggled with, and we want to show you where we struggled so you don't have to, is get the cable tie for the front gator on before you put the swinging arm in place. It will make life far easier when it comes to tightening it up, because you know it's gone on, it's already in the area, and you can just basically tighten it up and cut it off. So Rory's going to give us a hand getting this back in. There is a methodical way to doing this, but it's just a case of not rushing, not forcing, and then you'll feel the German build quality of this swinging arm and its relationship with the frame will just fall into place. So work through methodically and you'll get there. Swinging arms back in. It's, like I said before, it's a methodical task that you need to take time to make sure you get right, especially with locating the drive shaft within the gearbox. It can be done with the drive shaft in there, it can be done with the drive shaft out. As you saw from the footage, we were able to do it in all one hit, and it can be done if you're patient and methodical with it. Make sure that, once again, make sure you thoroughly reference our fitting instructions that's on the product page. All of the methodology as to how to do this up and the torque settings involved are all BMW based instructions, Motorrad based instructions from the factory that show you how to do it properly. That's the way you need to do it, and that's the way that it has been done. Next stage we're at now is, whilst Rory's putting the rear sets on there, we're going to get this back in place, get this final drive up and get the bolt through the torsion bar. Once again, you can see this isn't necessarily instructions that are within the instructions that are on the website. This is what we've learned from experience. You need to get this up and have a supporting hand on here to then swing this up and get this here. Have the bike in gear because you're going to need a little bit of rotation on the rear end, but you don't want this drive shaft to spin at the same time as you're rotating the disc. It just means that you can locate it on the splines, and then you'll know when it's correct, because it will very easy then slide in position and this bolt will come in line and you can put it through. Once you're at that stage, it's then a case of getting the caliper on, torquing the caliper, then doing a final check and just necessarily saying, okay, swing an arm and final drive wise, we're in a good position. We're then in a position to then say, okay, shock absorber in, torque it up, sign that off. Essentially, we're then missing a rear wheel and the workshop stand back into place, and the rear end of the bike is signed off. At that point, we then move forward back onto the airbox removal fundamentals, which is the throttle distribution, and then we're going to move back to the ABR stuff, throttle distribution box and how that's located to the bike, and then happy days. We're near enough reversing all that we've done in the previous videos, which is tank on, seat on, all that sort of stuff, and get it on the road. Cool.
So, 2 bolts, one at the top, one at the bottom. The torque setting is 56 Newton meters. We use a 1/2 inch torque wrench for those. It's basically a case of putting them back on. It's that simple, really. So we tend to get the T50 bolt on the shock, pop it into the top. The frame has basically got a thread on the other side of this. It's effectively captive, so that can just go in and be done up. Whiz that in there hand tight in order to hold it in place, straight in. Again, same tool, in we go. Hand tight to start off with. So 56 Newton meters on the torque wrench. Once we've done this bit and got the shock in and we're happy, all we need to do is just pop the rear wheel on. With the rear wheel, again, you're looking at the same T50 Torx setting. And we'll get to that once these ones are all good to go. Next up, I've just popped these in here to placehold them whilst we're doing all the other work on the bike, taking the airbox out. So buzz that on there, find the wheel, just done a runner. So when you're popping these in, what you kind of want to do is, this hub here, you can just see there's this slight cut out here. That will sit on the hub here and just sort of hold it in place for you. It won't hold it in place to the point where you can just sort of let go and let it sit on itself. what it will do is just allow you to be able to line those holes up if you hold it tight. One in there. Once you've got one bolt in, like that, you can basically spend a little bit of time popping the others. Once you have one in and in tight by hand, the wheel will sit there. When you come to do the wheel up, 60 Newton meters to torque, using the same torque setting, torque wrench, sorry, as the rear shock. And you want to do them up in a diagonal pattern. So if I just show you on here, you want to tighten one here, and then you go diagonally, 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 diagonally. So basically it pulls it on nice and evenly. You don't want to go round in a circle because that can pull it out of shape. So just check this is on 56, sorry, on 60. There we go. So start in one corner, doesn't matter which one. Put it into gear. That'll stop it from moving around. That's one. Diagonally, back diagonally to the other corner. Diagonally again. It's like a star shape, basically. There you go. Personally, I like to just double check everything a second time.
Okie doke, so this is near enough one of the final stages of the airbox removal, and that is the throttle distribution box and how we relocate it onto the DME cradle. Now this bit might be a little bit intimidating for most people, but don't sweat. As long as you've got the keys out the ignition and the battery disconnected, you're not going to come unstuck. I'm also going to cover in this section where you need to put the air intake temperature sensor. That's also going to be relocated with the throttle distribution box, which is going to be in this area here. So you're going to see me take the DME out. It's going to be removing these plugs here, which are on these slide cradles. One slides that way, one slides this way. The DME cabling can then move out the way. The DME can then be moved out of the cradle itself. You then want to line the box up with some very handy notches that have already been molded into the DME cradle as part of basically a bit of a blag from when we found out when we first took one apart. And the distribution box handily sits in that position. You'll then need a 5 or 6 mil drill bit, which will then run through the bottom of this hole here, which will then put a hole in the plastic of the DME cradle. That's then for one cable tie to run through, and then the second cable tie runs through what is a slot at the bottom of the DME cradle, which lines up with the two slots on either side of this distribution box. It is a real simple fit and a real simple modification that is, like I said, the final leg of this airbox removal. However, it can be intimidating due to the DME removal. Don't sweat it, crack on, and you'll get it done. Okay, so this bit also a little bit intimidating. However, just go slow and methodical with it and you'll be absolutely fine. So the cable, as you can see, comes down here and runs the outside of this main DME loom feed, as well as the feed from the fuel rail. This cable, the main throttle cable that runs from the throttle to the distribution box, that needs to be inside these two here to allow enough slack and a, how can I say, a comfortable position on the bike when the distribution box is relocated. You've got 4 clips here. Remove them and that will show you the internals of the throttle distribution box. This is just slid on here like so. Pull that off and you want to remove this one here. That one there is the main feed to the throttle. Pop that out of there, and that has freed up this throttle cable to then be fed behind these two here, like so, down into that area there, to be fed back in to the distribution box Easy enough. Like I said, a little bit fiddly, but it can certainly be done. Pop the cover back on, and then you continue with lining the box up in place with these notches here. This little section of the plastic needs to be nibbled away here with some pliers. Just cut this section of the plastic away so it sits with this lip here. Cut that away, and then this becomes the new lip in which this edge of the box is going to sit on. Okie doke. Now you can see you're at the stage where you've trimmed up the DME cradle. There is now a ledge from that trim that the distribution box is going to sit on. Make sure that the distribution box is level with the edge of where that trim was. With the box level, what you then want to do is, being careful of the wiring around you, is to run a 5 or 6 mil drill bit through the hole that is on the right hand side of the distribution box. That will then give you your hole in the DME cradle. Now by all means you can mark this with a pen or a pencil or something that can get through there. I usually put a drill bit through there without the drill in hand and just put a mark in the plastic. That will then give you your location where to then drill a hole into the DME cradle, which will then give you your hole for the cable tie to run round the cradle and locate at the top here. On the right hand side, on the left hand side of the cradle, you don't need to do that because you'll see that there's already a cutout in the bottom of the cradle that we can utilize for the left hand cable tie. Once that's done, we'll then piggyback the relocation of the air intake temperature sensor within those cable ties, and that will be this job finished. Moving on to that is the drilling of the tank. So that concludes the section of the airbox removal that is done on the bike. Now we're then going to move to the stuff that you need to do to drilling the tank to get the battery box fitted. We're going to go through some little bits. If you were fitting the Rapid Bike Evo, which we highly recommend when you're doing the airbox removal, to make the most of the additional airflow that's going to be added by the pod filters, as well as making up the difference of the air distribution on the cylinders across the engine. The most important thing for this section here is to make sure that you've got a smooth operating throttle. It needs to be a nice clean snap back and needs to be a clean feel when you do pull the throttle. You haven't done a huge amount regards the upper throttle work. All of the workings have been down on the distribution body here. However, as you can see, you need to have a nice sort of right angle from where the distribution box goes into the throttle cable, or sorry, the throttle hub on the right hand side. That then needs to be balanced. The vital bit when you're finishing off the job is balancing the throttles. I can't emphasize how much that needs to be done to make sure that the bike runs correctly. You only have 2 cylinders, and those 2 cylinders rely heavily on the synchronization of these throttles. So please make sure that you make time for that at the end of the build when everything's on and everything is ready, just before you go out on the road, all excited with your new airbox removal and pod filters on there. Make sure you balance those throttles. Anyway, that concludes everything on the bike. We're now going to move into the back room and show you how to drill out the tanks for both the Roadster model and the Pure, Urban GS and Scrambler models, as well as the Racer. We've reached the final stage, or one of the final stages of the airbox removal kit, and that is the fitting of the box itself, the PCC battery box. I have 2 tanks here. We got the Pure tank and the Roadster tank. aluminium and steel. This tank here is the tank that you'll find on the Urban GS, the Scrambler, the Pure and the Racer. There is a slight difference between the two tanks. That's why I wanted them both here, so I can show you the two different fitting methods for the box and how to get the alignment correct and get it drilled, and show you some sort of little bits of tips that we found along the way and things to avoid. So we're going to go ahead and show you how to do that. When you receive the Airbox Removal Kit, you're going to receive the battery box itself and a fitting kit with inside that. That consists of 3 Torx bolts, nuts, washers and some spacers. Now the spacers are there because you're going to need them according to which tank you have. There is a difference between the two sets of tanks that I spoke about earlier. You will see where those washers will come into play when I do the installation itself. When you receive your Airbox Removal Kit, you'll see the battery box itself has got 2 pairs of holes. The 2 sets of holes on each side correlate to each type of tank that you have, whether it's an aluminium roaster tank or whether it's a steel tank that you'll find on the Scrambler, the Pure, the Racer or the Urban GS. I'm going to show you how to align those two accordingly with each type of tank that you've got. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the differences between the two tanks. So we've got the roaster tank here and the tank off of the Pure. As you can see, this one has its breather hoses. This one does not. That's purely due to the fact that the aluminium roaster tank, the hoses run through the centre of this cross section that is the ledge where the alarm system sits. The alarm system sits is an option on some bikes. Whereas on the Pure, you'll see that the breather hoses have been removed because there is no cross section here for them to go through, so they are left on the bike when we remove the tanks. This is very important as to where you drill your holes on the roadster bike, due to the fact that you don't want these in the way. So make sure these are removed before you go ahead and do anything on the tank regards any of the drilling. Like I said, with the Pure tank, you don't need to worry about that because they already be left on the bike. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on how to fit the battery box on the Pure tank, but first we're going to start with the roaster tank. Okay, so we've got the battery box in the roadster tank. You'll see that there's a hole that is already pre-drilled in the tank. The holes on the battery boxes are there to align with this hole that is on the tank itself. You also see that there's a little bit of a gap here between the ledge and the tank structure itself. The material that we made the battery box out of, is designed deliberately to have an interference fit underneath there. You'll find that when the holes are drilled, which will be done from underneath, because you can see that there's not enough distance between the tank here to get a drill bit in without damaging the tank, you'll then have to just give this a slight tap from the front of the battery box with a rubber hammer, which will then bring this in line parallel with the back ledge of the tank, bringing the battery box square. Okay, so as I said earlier, the drilling the marking and the drilling for the tank is all going to be done from underneath. As you can see, we've got the bolt that we already put through earlier. That's going to act as our alignment. You'll also see that there's this little pin that's sticking down from the top of the tank. That's just been pressed in to the tank. That's something that you won't find on the Pures. And you'll see that when I offer the box up, that pin ever so slightly stops the box sitting perfectly flat with the bottom of the ledge. This can be removed with some pliers by giving it a wiggle, because it has only been pressed in, giving it a wiggle to loosen it and then giving it a tap out. Once that is out the way, you can then align the battery box up with the bolt that we've already put through, and then align the back of the box square to the ledge. So measure your distance between here and here to ensure that you're square. Once you've done that, grab a G-clamp or something that you can clamp the box to the tank with, and then you can then go ahead and drill through with an M8 drill bit through here. As you can see, I've mocked up the box with a clamp, and I've also found a non-nylock 13mm nut, which is the easiest thing to hold the box in place whilst you're doing all this. Obviously, if you don't have one of those, use the nylocks, they're still fine to do that. So now that we got the battery box square with the edge of the shelf on the tank itself, it's now ready to drill. The easiest way to do it, I know you might think to mark it, take the box off and then drill it, but the easiest way to do it is just to have the box in place, clamped as tight as you possibly can with whatever you've got around the house or the garage, and then using the holes on the battery box itself as a guide. It means that you can't go, you've got 2 layers of metal to go through here because you've then got this cross section of the shelf itself. You can't go wrong if you're using the battery box as a guide. It's by far the easiest way. We've done absolutely tons of these and it's foolproof. So we're going to go ahead and drill that now. Okay, so we've got the battery box fitted on the roadster tank here. Now, if you've got an alarm system that's fitted on the top of the shelf of the tank and you need to fit the box from underneath, that's where the spacers that are supplied with our kit come into their own. You'll see that there'll be a gap where the ledge steps down onto the intersection of the cross section of the shelf. You then use 2 of these spacers to go in between that gap, and then that will then stop the battery box being squished up to meet the space of the metal above it, and then you know that it will be nice and secure. All of that stuff is supplied within the kit. So we've got the battery box fitted on the top of the shelf of the roadster tank. Put the initial bolt in the first hole that we originally used for the alignment. Get that in place, and then you'll then see that the shelf and the edge of the battery box is out of square. As I mentioned to you earlier in the video, you'll see that you've got this intersection here where the interference fit of the battery box needs to go on there. This is the bit now where we just use a rubber hammer just to hit the front edge of the box till the bolt holes align. Once you've got them aligned, you can then put the bolts through from the top and then lock up from underneath. Job's good. Okay, so the battery box is fitted to the roadster tank. The last little bit is to put these pipes through. You'll see that there'll be a bolt now in the space where these pipes were. One pipe sits the other side of the bolt, one pipe sits on the inside. It's going to be a little bit fiddly, but you can get it through, and it's much easier to do it now, and it's the proper way to do it, have it fitted through that intersection of the shelf, as that's how BMW wanted it done from the factory. Like I said, a little bit fiddly, but you can get it done, and then you'll be at that stage once it's done to get it back on the bike. Okay, so that's the roadster tank all done and dusted, fitted up with the breather hoses, back in place, routed as they're meant to be, ready to go back on a bike. I'm going to start on the Pier bike now. It's a very similar process, if anything possibly a little bit easier on the steel tanks that, like I said, is on the Pier, the Scrambler, Urban GS and the Racer. There's a few clips that you're going to have to remove if you've got an alarm system fitted, just to allow for a little bit of spacing. Other than that, we're going to get into it because it's fairly simple. Okay, so we are on to the Pier tank, which is the same tank, as I keep saying, as the Scrambler, the Urban GS and the Racer. Sorry to repeat myself, but I just want to make sure that anybody that's come in halfway through the video isn't going to think, oh, it's a Pier tank, it's not going to work on mine, because it does. There's just a difference between the Roadster and the rest of the models. So unlike the Roadster, there is no hole already on the shelf of the tank, and you'll see that it's got what is essentially a perimeter around the shelf that stops the battery box being fitted on top, because there's this hollow space here because of the perimeter metal. So it has to go underneath. So if you've got an alarm system on your bike, it makes no difference at all. You can leave these clips in place because they are going to be there and left alone. So the spacers that have been supplied in the kit are very vital for this tank because the spaces are going to fill the gap between this support weld for this tank bracket and the space that is the surface area on the top of the battery box. Alignment wise, you want to make sure that it's square from the get-go. This is something that you're going to do, purely eyeball it and then measure from the front of the ledge to the front of the battery box. You then want to clamp it, and then repeating the process that we did on the Roadster, it's all drilled up from the bottom. Got the battery box jigged up on the tank. You'll see that there's two sets of pairs of holes on the battery box itself. When drilling the box, you want to make sure that the hole you're using on the left-hand side, as you're looking at the bike, is aligned between the tank and the weld that supports the main structure of the tank, which is welded to the shaft. That will then allow that bolt to go through and be clear of the swage mark that is on the top of the shaft. On the right-hand side, you then want to drill the inner hole for the same reason that as the bolt goes through, it will then be clear of the swage mark that's on top of the shaft of the bike. So as you're looking at the box itself, just to recap, you want to be drilling the bolt that's on the left hand side outer and on the right hand side inner. So got the initial hole drilled on the battery box, very similar to what we've done on the Roadster, where it's got that hole through it already so that we can use the alignment of the other two holes. We've done that here on the Pier tank. So I've got that through, I've put that non-Loctite or non-Nylock nut on just to hold it in place. I'm then going to double check the square, measuring from the front edge of the perimeter of the shaft to the front edge of the battery box, get it cranked up on the clamp and get the rest drilled. So we've got that tank drilled and the battery box fitted. I just want to take this opportunity just to give you a little bit of a tip of what we found when I've been fitting the battery boxes in sales. You'll see that it's not an act of magic or anything strange from the universe that these are staying on here. There's a little daub of super glue on each one of these. I found it easy to stick the washers, or the spacers I should say, to the battery box before you fit it on one of the non-Roadster tanks. I've cut out a little bit of the spacer there just to make it clear of the weld that is on the underside of the tank there. It's far easier to have these glued to the box themselves. It just makes it a lot less painful process when you're trying to get the bolt through, hold the box up with the battery in it. It all gets really messy and very annoying quite quickly. So just a dab of super glue on each one of those with the drill bit or the bolt through the hole just to make sure it's in line with the hole beneath it, and it makes your life much easier. Once you've done this bit, you can then bosh it in, get the nuts in, get the bolts through and get it bolted on up. Now that we got the boxes test fitted on both of the tanks behind us, before you go ahead and get that bolted up, the important bit is to get the battery in the box itself before it's then mounted into the tank, because you can't actually get the battery into the box once it is bolted into the tank. Very important bit of the process is the battery terminals now need to be facing the back of the bike. So as you're looking at the bike, if you're sitting on the saddle looking forward, the positive terminal is going to be on the left and the negative terminal is now going to be on the right. That's opposite to how you find it on the bike. It's very important that you do it this way around, otherwise you're going to have trouble with finding the slack in the loom to get the terminals and the cables to the terminals themselves and then bolted up. It's a case of simply sliding that in there like so, and that is the battery in the battery box ready to go. Now, if you are fitting a Rapid Bike Evo, we always mount our Rapid Bike Evos on the front of the battery box. It's a nice, neat, available space that keeps everything together, and you're able to easily get the Rapid Bike Evo loom round through the frame, over the battery and plugged in here. It then leaves all of the cables and plugs accessible just by removing the tank. We drill holes through the battery box here, riv nut and bolt our Rapid Bike Evos to the front of the box here. Use screws for that process that are no longer than 20 millimeters. They also act as ever so slight braces to the battery in the box by putting a little bit of pressure of the battery in the box itself, acting as a stopper from it rattling around. If you're not fitting a Rapid Bike Evo, find yourself some foam and then put some foam between the battery box and the battery, just to keep the battery ever so slightly snug in the box itself, just to make sure it can't rattle around. However, it's not going to fall out. The battery is too deep within the box and then sits on the top of the tank. So the tank then interacts with these areas of the battery here. That means it can't come out of the box. However, like I said, get some foam or some fabric down in here just to act as a squeeze on the battery itself. Apart from that, that's all you really need to know about getting the battery in the battery box. Now, you'll see that this is a lead that is mounted to the loom, and sorry, this is a lead that is bolted to the loom that's on the top of the bike, and then also bolted to the battery terminal itself. This is the end that goes to the battery terminal, and this is on the loom. Take this off of the seat cradle mount and swap them over, but keep the bolts in the same position they are. Then bolt this to the battery before you then put it into the tank and get it fitted. It's far easier to have this done beforehand. Obviously you can't do that with a negative terminal because the negative terminal is still on the bike and is part of the loom. This section is part of what is, like I said, the jump post that is on the seat mount there. Get this bolted up using the original BMW battery bolts. We torque these up to 8 Newton meters. We have had it before where when testing some of the battery terminals had come loose. That's because we done them up without necessarily a torque setting in place. I've done some experimenting and found that 8 Newton meters is the perfect torque setting for these batteries, and we've had no problems ever since. This end here with the little hood on, that denotes the end for the battery. Get that bolted in. This is taped into the loom. Undo the tape, and then this frees this little section up here. Get that bolted on and torqued up, and then you can then get the battery box into the tank, get it bolted on, make sure you're all tight on all 3 of the bolts on the bottom of the tank. Then we can get the battery box and the tank in their new position, fitted on the bike. So, as I keep saying, final stage, but this is really the final stage of the airbox removal, and that is getting the pod filters on and the crank filter. We will recommend the DNA filters. The kit will come with DNA filters if you selected them. It will come with 2 pod filters and a crank filter. You can use, with the DNA filters, you can use the original BMW ring clips that hold the original throttle stubs on. They can hold the filters on as well. You don't have to go all the way around with the clip to its original position. If you just put the filter on first and then put the ring clip on around, you can then go to the first click and you'll see that it is solid, not coming off. That method has been thoroughly tested. We haven't had one come off yet. It is solid. Regards the crank filter, that goes on the left-hand cylinder where the crank breather pipe came out that originally went to the airbox. That is a case of just sliding it on and putting a Jubilee clip around there and it won't come off. Now, what we found is for people that live in hotter climates or people that use the Airbox Removal Kit for track use, is that you will get, due to the higher internal temperature of the engine, you'll find that you'll get a little bit of breathing out of an oil breathe out of the crank filter itself. You can eliminate that by using the tube that was the original breather tube to the airbox removal, sorry, to the original BMW airbox, by extending this filter and having it located just above the gearbox. Having made a metal sleeve that slides inside the tube, and then Jubilee clips are here at both ends. That then just raises the crank filter up above the level of the oil line, and it means you're not going to get any oil dripping out of the filter itself. You're only going to get gases exhausting out. Other than that, we are now at the stage where we can get the tank back on and pretty much sign it off.